finish your half of the picture, then I'll talk about my part. And then we can, just have a conversational whenever we go. Yes. We just look at each other, right? All right. Okay. Good. No.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to Estrad, both you here in the room and you who are with us on the web. I also want to say welcome to our speakers, Anders Berglund and Neeraj Sonalkar.
Perfect.
It was right.
Thank you.
But first I want to say a few words about ESPRI, the organization that arranged these lectures. My name is Helen Torgrimsson and I work as a project manager at ESPRI. If you haven't already visited our website, esprit.se, please do that. You will find more than 100 earlier arranged lectures via web TV, a lot of clips from other events, and a huge amount of articles on innovation, entrepreneurship, and SMEs. Today's lecture will start in a minute, and after about 45 minutes, we will have a fika break. Then coffee and tea will be served inside this room. After the break, you will present more interesting facts, and before we finish at 5, there will be time for questions.
Right.
I would like to thank our main partners, Tillväxtverket and Vinnova, and our partner, Länsstyrelsen in Stockholm. Thanks to their support, we can arrange Estrad free of cost for you. Okay, that was all from me. Let's give Gustav and Neeraj a big hand.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for joining here today. This is really interesting opportunity for us. And thank you, Neeraj, to come straight from Germany today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
To be here. So me and Neeraj, if we cut very short how we come across working together, we can say that we've been working, almost 10 years now together.
Yeah.
Collaborating on our design courses, basically focusing on innovation. And today we're going to discuss partly what we found in the industry, very interesting things, and also relating to how can we work this as a learning mechanism within academia as well.
Yeah.
So the topic, or the title for this session, we call Understanding Innovation Genome. And it's partly just to trigger the interest also, but we'll see how we actually divide that as we go along. So,
sounds good.
So from design to the innovation genome.
I think you have to point it. Okay, good.
Okay. Do you want to say something about your background?
Yes. So this is a picture from where I come. The Stanford University Design Group. This is a group within the School of Engineering. So design actually sits within the engineering discipline, but it's very cross-disciplinary in nature. And this is a big space we have. This is just to give you a context. I like to show spaces rather than people, as well as, or just doing work, because that gives you a sense of where we are coming from, what's the mindset to some extent.
For me, I jumped straight into the class. So this is a design team working together. And we actually talked before, in the pictures that went in here, how do we explain in a picture our environment? And then we said, wow, okay, they're pretty not similar if you look at it, because here we have a session where we have students focusing on how can they develop a new innovation. Here you have them but there is a mentor or a person standing in front of them. So which way, we will not dive into that in terms of how should you go about doing it. It's just put an example up on the environment that we actually been working with.
Okay, good.
And that was my past environment the last 10 years at KTH. So now, let's jump into design.
Yes, we use this word design, but what does it actually mean? When I have actually talked in various different countries, the word design means different things for different communities, whatever background you have. We use the word design very broadly. You know, we use it as a verb rather than a noun. So it is actually to do an action. It's to conceive, to plan, to have an intention, and to work towards it. We like the definition given by Herbert Simon. He was an economist and one of the early fathers of artificial intelligence who got very curious about design, and he wanted to invent computers who could design. We don't have them yet, but as he started working towards that goal, he found out more about what design is, and he wrote a very interesting book called The Sciences of the Artificial. That just as we have a natural science which studies the natural world, you know, the earth, the sun, the moon, you know, the biological phenomena, we have artificial sciences, engineering, crafts, you know, law, policy making, where we actually create artificial things. And design is a science of the artificial, how to make things, how to move from the current state where we are to a future state where we desire to go. And you might have perhaps heard this term design thinking, which has come into vogue since 2006. So what design thinking does is that it's a paradigm. It takes something which is from the disciplines of design. The disciplines of design could be industrial design, engineering design, architecture, who have traditionally done design work. Design thinking takes some of those principles and makes them available to all people. It makes them available to doctors, to business people, to lawmakers, to policymakers, you know, to humanities and so on. And that's what we call design thinking. So that's the non-disciplinary framework of design.
Another,
you have some,
just another thing also that's interesting. How many that's been starting to use design thinking as a way of approaching innovation in recent years? I know that for a fact here in Stockholm there are many, not only companies, but also in academia, we find many things that how can we evolve and make design thinking a mechanism towards innovation. I think we have interesting field work on both sides that we've been touching upon when we work with that creation of a mindset, as we should say.
Yeah, good, yes.
So
I have to point it towards that.
Yeah.
So we love showing this picture. You know, this is where we have come from. From here to there, this is a bit dated. So this was taken in the 1990s. You know, right now we are, you know, right next to our smartphones and doing like this. So it's a pinch and zoom world. Design for me actually means going back. It's a kind of a regression to a different mindset, to being a hunter once again. And we use that term hunter because you are in a world of uncertainties. You are navigating that world of dynamic happenings. And how do you keep it in mind as you hunt for big ideas, big opportunities? It's a different frame of mind than being statically situated on a desk and working at a 9-to-5 job. So this hunting mindset, how do we take on that hunting mindset, is something that has become, you know, what we have looked into in our research. I don't think we have a whiteboard, we'll just show it.
Yeah, we don't have a whiteboard here, so.
So we have this model, we call it the hunter model, using that metaphor of hunting. And a lot of times, you know, when we think about moving from the current state to a future preferred state, let's say you are here at point A, and you think that, you know, you want to design a company, you want to design a technology, which is point B. You know, going from A to B is not a straight line, as a lot of you would have found out, that you cannot just go, you know, straight from A to B. As you start walking towards B, you realize maybe B is not the right point. Maybe it should be B prime, and you start walking differently. You come up with new ideas, you discover new knowledge, and that makes your walk, zigzag. And that's what we call as wayfaring. It is not something you can plan for and just execute. So the skill of execution, while it's required, you also need to have the skill of changing directions, understanding when to change, when not to change. Sometimes you may come up to a dead end and you have to backtrack. How can we be comfortable with that emotionally? How do we deal with failure? How do we deal with failure of our team members? So these are all important questions that come into picture when we are doing this kind of a hunt or this wayfaring.
Another thing that we should point out here is also that maybe it looks like a straight line here, right? Once you get to the final B solution.
Right.
And this is something that we've been talking about. Hey, it's not that straight. Because once you have to start implementing it and get anchoring of the different decisions within the organization, within the company and so on, it might be equal as a hunting process. So you have to really be careful about how you go about making these momentum towards realizing the innovation along the way. One way would be to, the final destination is of course the innovation. However, realizing the innovation is part of it. So make sure that you have a good momentum on your way sort of back of realizing it as well. Or whether you would land there in the B, that everything is set in motion right away.
Yeah.
I think we can move on.
Okay. This is a bit of the background of the lab where I'm coming from, the Center for Design Research. So this center was established in 1984 to understand what do engineers do when they're designing new technology, products, and so on. And we have been looking since then, not so much in the technology itself, but on the people side. What do the people do who are developing these technologies, who are working in teams, who are working within organizations, or who are working within startups, or working with investors and venture capitalists? And from that has resulted 30+ PhD dissertations, articles, research, and so on. And that's the body of knowledge that we have. But more importantly, in today's world, it's not sufficient to know things. We need to do things. So we need a body of behaviors. And the body of behaviors, we teach a course called HEMI 310, which is not coming up. It's coming up right now. And this is a team-based design course where we have a team of Stanford students working with a team in a partner university. And that university could be KTH. We have worked with you in the past. And these two teams then work together across cultural boundaries, across disciplinary boundaries, and work with a corporate sponsor who gives them a very broad challenge. An example could be Volkswagen, who said, invent something that would improve the fitness of drivers in cars. What does that mean? What does fitness mean in a car? And how do you do that? So it's a very broad, open-ended prompt that the design teams work on. But they actually work within this kind of an organization. There are 10 teams partnering with 14 universities. They have a background of around 40 companies. And it looks like a mess. And many a times it feels like one too. But that's the key, is that you don't try to sort out the mess. You actually try to work within it and discover what kind of an organization exists in that setting. What we have done is we have taken this course, and building on it, we have developed entrepreneurial spaces in developing countries. We have developed a space in India, we have developed one in Nigeria, but now working more on the startup side. So working with aspiring entrepreneurs, working with investors, working with local business leaders, as well as local government, to see how do we develop a culture which is not a copy of places like Silicon Valley or Boston or Austin, but actually it is uniquely grown. It's a biological metaphor. It's not a manufacturing metaphor. We are not replicating or mass manufacturing. It's a biologically grown culture. How do you do that, and what's the method? So we'll talk a bit about that too. So that's my background, to give you a bit more context. And here comes Andrew.
And since I moved away from KTH, now there's, you can pull forward. There's less of a dissertation number there, but still, you know, I've been working research-wise for quite some time, done a bunch of publications, and these are some of the conferences and areas that my area, we have strong connecting points there, since we're focusing on innovation and design, both of us.
Yeah. And
Did my mic go off?
no, I think.
Hello? Still working? Okay, and the picture you saw before, many of my past experiences has been focusing on the design team. How do they get to realize the innovation, and what is radical in these, or is it just incremental? What can be done to facilitate them? And yes, the facilitating part will be very interesting, because that's something that we have touched upon, but from a different angle, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you look at, you know, what kind of researchers are we? We are not just people who do laboratory studies and, you know, who do correlations and quantitative analyses of surveys and so on. We are actually ethnographers. We go out and observe. We are engineers, so we go out and build spaces and build communities. And by doing that, we learn. So research happens through building and through making. And that's a very key point, is that when you are a design researcher, you are not a natural science researcher, or you're not a medical researcher. It comes with a different kind of a methodology of understanding and generating knowledge. So to give you an example, we might look at a design situation, a meeting where people are coming together, they're working on something. We could look at one of the groups who is sitting out there in the common space and, you know, sharing ideas or having a meeting with some investors or somebody. And we look at different factors. We look at the person level. You know, who are these people? What are they bringing? What's their cognitive style of thinking? What's their emotional expression? We look at the environment. We look at the physical environment. We look at the organizational environment. We look at the artifact or the media which the people are using. Are they working on laptops? Are they working on big whiteboards? How does that change the way they think? And we also look at behavior, the interactions, the thinking, you know, the reasoning behaviors and so on. And we are bringing it all together to see, okay, you know, can we now help design or help people develop into high performance teams, high performance startups, high performance corporate teams who are in pursuit of novelty, who are in pursuit of the next breakthrough. So if you look at just, this is just one setting, you know, but if you look at a region, you know, okay, this is always going to take a bit of time. A region like Silicon Valley or a region like Stockholm, right? A lot of people who visit a place like Silicon Valley fixate on the companies, you know, brand names and logos and swanky office spaces. But it's these meetings, it's these conversations which are actually more important. And they're happening in all kinds of places. They're happening in corporate offices, in startup spaces, they're happening in cafes. And that is the real pulse of a place, is the conversation, the interaction. And then the flows between conversation. How does capital flow through these conversations? How do ideas flow? How does knowledge flow? And if we can capture the flow, then that becomes the key metric for the entrepreneurial ecosystem of that city. So that's some of the work that we have been doing and we have been looking at. So in this talk, what we'll do, let's see if that's the next one. And I don't know that yet. Okay, not really. We use this title, you know, Innovation Genome. So we'll just talk briefly to why did we use that. We have been really inspired by the Human Genome Project. This was an international collaboration that actually started in 1990s till 2003 and led to the mapping of the human genome. So a lot of research groups from different countries came together, and it was a huge endeavor that people said was important for humanity. And what we believe is that we need to do something similar to understand innovation. it is not just about building spaces, or just starting to copy other regions who are successful. We need to really understand what are the basic building blocks of innovation. And in today's talk, we hope to shed some light on them. We don't know the genome yet. We are working towards that, and we'll need your help to actually understand the innovation genome fully. But what we'll do right now is to actually look at a few levels. Blank slide, okay.
Blank level.
Yes. So we'll look at innovation factors at individual level. So we'll start with a person, an individual. What needs to happen at an individual level for innovation to thrive? Then we'll look at the team level. I'm trying out different angles with this. Okay, maybe this will work. Innovation factors at team level. Then we'll look at the organizational level. And lastly, we'll look at the regional ecosystem. That could be a city or a couple of cities or a small region. And by understanding how these play with each other, how they reinforce each other, that is in our view, what we would call as, the genome. This is a complex phenomena. And in today's talk, we are actually going to share a lot of information, which might be a bit too much at times. But what I suggest is, as you're listening, just think about what resonates with you, what kind of questions come up, what is relevant to you, to your company, to the work that you're doing. And that can lead to a very fruitful discussion after the talk. You want to add something?
No, thank you.
Great. So let's start with the first level, shall we? Okay, I missed that angle. Okay, here it is. Individual level. Okay, it's my turn. Yeah. So,
I can.
Innovation, we use that word quite a lot. So I felt the need to define it. So the realization of radical and relevant artifacts and experiences. And when we think of innovation, we have some key examples. All of us may have different examples. Some of the examples, Apple I, the first computer that the Apple company launched, Uber as a service model or a business model, PayPal, which disrupted the financial market back in the 90s or early 2000s, Square, which is quite ubiquitous, which has enabled small vendors to actually use carts and cart transactions, and Kickstarter like platforms which have actually democratized the raising of funds to do the work that you need to do. But if you look at innovation, this is all desirable. Every city wants to have companies like this which would change or transform the fields that they are working in. But we use a different metaphor. Let's go to the metaphorical level now. Okay, and we can think of these as the fruits of a tree. So they are the fruits. And if we want the fruit, we can't just buy them. We have to grow the tree in a particular region. How do you grow the tree? What is the tree? So for us, the tree is an aggregation of social interactions. How we are interacting with each other, that is the core phenomena. And beneath the tree, beneath that level of interaction are the roots, which you could think of as, I might just use this one actually, perception and beliefs. What is the perception that each of us is holding at this point of time? When we look at a person, when we look at a space, an organization, what perception and beliefs do we go in with? So let me talk a bit about that. Have you all seen this picture? Yeah, it's quite famous, right? In here you can see that the same picture actually has two different perceptions within it. You can perceive an old woman, if you think of this as the mouth, the nose, right? Or you can perceive the picture as a young woman, if you can think of this as the chin and then that's the nose and so on. So the same picture, the same signal that you receive through your visual cortex, the same stimulus that you get has different perceptions. We noticed something similar in this space we had in the city of Ahmedabad in India. We met this young person there, And we worked with him. He was an entrepreneur. He is still doing his venture, which is good. But a few of our group perceived him very differently. Some of us perceived him as lazy and arrogant. Some of us perceived him as a creative geek who is so caught up in his ideas that he forgets to shower. He actually forgets to wear sandals. His room is all messy. So the behaviors, the same stimulus, but people perceive it differently. And depending on how you perceive that person, you would behave with that person differently. And that is where the cycle starts for innovation. If you perceive the person as lazy and arrogant because they are not following rules, because they are not sticking to the code of the organization, you would behave with that person possibly with a domineering sense, with contempt. You would like to set them right. But if you perceive them as creative, you might say, okay, what can you do to help this person reach the next level? While perhaps forgiving some of his flaws and suggesting that he remedy some. Right? But that behavior differs very sharply. And the same for innovation spaces. We have seen a lot of innovation spaces. We have helped build a few. And we have seen that people perceive them very differently. Some people perceive them as an input and output factory. How many people coming in, how many ventures going out. And that's how they define success. And that's on, as it's just a factory metaphor. And some people perceive them as spaces, as watering holes for what we might say deviance. People who are thinking differently. And they're there to actually sharpen or deepen those thoughts and have interactions between them. But depending upon how you perceive the space, you would manage it differently. The kind of rules you would put within that organization would be different. Which we come back to the same picture again. Perception. And we use this metaphor of a plantation and a rainforest. So if you perceive something as very sharply organized, or something that is chaotic, meant to retain that chaos, it actually leads to different outcomes. So this metaphor, plantation versus a rainforest, comes from a book by Wang and Horowitz, who are actually investors in Silicon Valley. And they actually came both to Silicon Valley from different cities within US. And when they came there, they said, you know what, people here, there's something different going on. There's a different set of rules that they're following. They're not thinking like other cities. What is that? And they tried to codify that, their thinking, in this metaphor. So a plantation is like a farm. Right? Its purpose is to have one crop yield and to maximize yield. It lives for the sake of optimization. It lives for the sake of efficiency. So if a new weed grows into a plantation, you have to kill it because that is not the crop you want. But a rainforest, in a rainforest, weeds thrive. When a new weed comes up, you should not kill it or you cannot kill it. It's just too diverse. You don't know what a weed is and what a meaningful plant is. It is chaotic, but it's also very diverse. And there's a lot of synthesis going on within a rainforest. So innovation requires a rainforest way of thinking and being versus a plantation way of thinking and being, which also has implications for management. If you're managing an innovation space, how do you manage a rainforest? Can you manage a rainforest? We don't have principles of management of rainforests yet. So that's a very different way of thinking. We all know how to manage this space. We have MBAs, we have management science books, which tell us how to maximize yield and strive for efficiency. But then the question becomes, how do you do both at times? So these are the rules of a plantation versus the rules of a rainforest. And this is, again, from Victor and Greg's book. So you can take your time to read some of these.
I think we can add something here also, that we had a
Yes.
discussion about how does it fit into an organization now. We can see that many organizations or companies here in Stockholm, Sweden, And Sweden overall, I would say, we could come back to some of the statistics we talked about earlier.
Yes.
How Sweden has moved up on the innovation charts, whereas the States has dropped out of the top 10 in the world. So that's interesting. But in terms of this, from an organizational perspective, we can see that there are rainforests within the companies. So they use, we talked about the environments, or you mentioned that, there's these mini hubs within the organizations that actually includes SMEs or other parties that might be external for the companies, just to build this sense of inclusion with the knowledge that maybe it's not skills that they have within the company already. And that's sort of making a small rainforests within the team, within the organizations.
That's right. Yeah. So the thing is that, you know, it's not that this is bad and this is good. An organization or a region would need both. You know, we sometimes use the metaphor, now to switch metaphors, we sometimes use the metaphor that innovation is like having salt within a stew. You don't need a lot of salt, you just need a pinch of salt, but you need it nevertheless. So you need the rainforest as much as you need a plantation. But we don't know yet how to manage the rainforest first, and we don't know how to manage the collaboration between them. And many times there is a tension between the two communities if they do exist. And letting that tension thrive, letting both communities thrive, is a key challenge that we're looking into as researchers. Right. Okay. One more dichotomy, you know. Many times when we think about solving something, you know, we come up with this term problem solving. You know, we use logic, we use reasoning. That's the right way of solving problems. That's what we learn in school, many times in universities too. But when we actually, and that pertains to knowledge, you know, we gain knowledge, we gain expertise by following this problem solving viewpoint. But when we are doing design work, and which actually leads to innovative outcomes, we just don't deal with knowledge space. There is a different kind of a space we're dealing with. That is what we call a concept space. And there's a theory in design research called CK theory, or concept knowledge theory, that as designers, we need to navigate these two spaces. We may start in knowledge, but we actually then walk over to concept and then back to knowledge. And we do this back and forth, zigzag, till we finally finish in the knowledge space with a technology, a product, a service that is fully realized. But the science, or the understanding of how you navigate the concept space is not very well known. Many times we put it down, we consider that as too soft, or that's the realm of artists. You know, that's not serious stuff. Serious stuff is this. Right? But as innovators, it's very important to navigate these two spaces. Right? And here's the navigation coming. So one of the things is, as an individual who is doing innovation, the capacity to generate and respond to novelty is an important characteristic. How do we face novelty? Something new, something we have not heard of. How do we respond to it? And how do we generate it in the first place? You want to talk about generation, problem solution?
Well, with the example that we mentioned before, you mean?
Yeah, that's something.
Sure. One thing that we tend to do is sometimes when I host design thinking exercises or workshops, we talked about how do you separate a solution fixation, when you focus too much on the solution initially versus when you actually draw and try to focus on the possibilities. So one way of actually try to do that, take 15 seconds for yourself and think about how would you like to get to this meeting today if you have all the possibilities available. Think about your own context, of course, and your home environment and everything. And now, after 15 seconds, think about, can that be applied to other persons, the person next to me? What would have to be modified? So what we're doing now is focusing on the sort of, we're facing a problem, but we're really jumping towards a solution immediately. Trying to find our own solution, then test it internally on others. Sometimes we develop products this way. Sometimes we say that we do innovation, but we rarely do the testing that is required to get them successful. So what would happen if now you turn to your neighbor and would ask the same, well, one of the things that you probably need information about, how they would perceive to getting here to this meeting? Would you probably, do you think you will get the same answers and the same ideas? Maybe, maybe not. So this, we don't take time to do this right now, but we could actually do this. You can do this over longer term, of course, in a few minutes and so on, sketch and everything. The thing is that you probably get new insights doing so. And what's interesting is that you have to take into account as many users or people that might partake in this innovation or solution in the end. Have we reshaped the transportation system all of a sudden? Or have we done something with these facilities, or what has happened? So this is something that looks more towards the possibilities, or something that goes beyond the solution fixation that part of the design thinking fundamental ideas resides about. Okay, I think we can move on.
Okay, good, yeah. So here we talked about, just thinking in terms of solutions versus having a problem or a need orientation, right? And that helps in generating novelty, that helps in generating ideas. Next, we'll look at how do you respond to ideas. Let's say you are a manager, or let's say you are an investor who is hearing a venture pitch. Here's an example. So please take some time to read this and think that you are a manager or an investor who this person is going to come to and suggest for help, ask for funding, ask for support. How would you respond to this person? Imagine this is the first time you've heard of what is this thing, is health car. How would you respond to this person? I'm sorry if it's a bit low. I had not thought of the height. Any thoughts? Would anybody like to say something? If you are a manager, how would you respond? Anyone?
No
Yes.
responses.
Yeah.
One minute, sorry.
Oh, okay. You have a mic.
Use the
You have a
mic.
mic coming your way. Yes.
Hi. I'd look for an MVP, see if there's more of a minimum viable product that could be created at a cheaper cost.
Okay, MVP.
Or more proof that this could succeed.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. That's a great answer. Good. Okay. Anybody else? A different viewpoint? No? Okay,
Yeah.
we have one. Yeah.
Well, of course, the market, you have to look at the market and evaluate the markets. You need to look at, is there a need?
Yes.
And what are the numbers you want to, is it the standard option? You need to look at should all cars be health cars, or, but I think the market is the most important. Is there a need out there?
Is there a need? Yes.
And how many of our cars should be health cars?
Yeah. Good point. Okay, we have one more hand up there.
I'm a little confused, I think, because it says health coach, but it says also diagnosis. So a health coach is maybe an AI you talk to, maybe it's Google Home you talk to, and you do cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah.
That could be very interesting. But
yes.
diagnosis is more sensors.
Yeah.
You could, of course, do diagnosis through questionnaires also, yes.
Right.
So yeah, I think it could be interesting, but I think what it needs to be you can actually have a health coach in the car and have them phone the person. That would be your first minimum viable product. You don't have to put AI in there. Forget the technology for a while and just use analog stuff to see if it works, if people are willing to use it.
Yes.
It's expensive, but it's more expensive to fail then than fail later.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's great. Okay, we'll just move on in interest of time, but we can talk later if that's okay. That's great. So many times, the responses that you gave were excellent. Right up to understanding about the entrepreneurial need, the market. How might you go forward? What's the next step? Right. Many times we have seen that some investors or managers who come to this space come with this problem solution mindset, and they ask these kind of questions, oh, what can go wrong with this concept? How risky are these problems? Can we solve these problems, or we don't have the capability? Possibly this is more of a managerial concern than an entrepreneurial one, actually. Is this the right time to solve this problem? So time is important in both spaces, actually. Should I risk my reputation, especially within an organization, which is actually quite important? And what we have found out is that, instead of answering or asking these questions, there is a different way. We call it the possibility barrier mindset, which actually leads with possibility rather than the problem and what can go wrong with it. And these are the questions we ask from that mindset. What is everything that could go right with this concept? And how big could this become? That was the market question. That was actually great, as well as the ideas that you discussed. Does the possibility excite and motivate me? What is my role? So bringing the individual inside is actually quite important. Where is that emotional motivation that would drive me to do this, or which would say, I don't feel like doing this. I'm out. What are the barriers then to realizing the possibility, and how do I work with this person to address and overcome these barriers? Once we are thinking from this mindset, our response to novelty changes. It actually becomes more of a collaboration where we are co-imagining things. It's not just the burden on the employee or the entrepreneur and my role as the judge. I am the entrepreneur too, as an investor. And how do I then respond? So that actually is something which we are seeing within the spaces that we are working with. Okay, so let's take a quick pause and we go to the next level, the team level. You want to go ahead, Anders?
Yeah, sure, we can do. I think we should start with the team before we have a coffee break, right?
What time is it? It's 46. Okay.
Okay. So one thing that I've been working a lot with is, in order for a team to work, you need to have open areas in terms of feedback. And actually, how do you promote feedback within a team to one another has a huge impact, huge impact. And from an education point of view, we can see that actually what you see down below here, it's the single most important factor and influence on the learning by itself. So from an academic and learning perspective, it has had tremendous impact on how do you design the courses if you want to develop innovation in the end. And there's also this question about how do you actually go about providing feedback to one another. Sorry. I'm glad that you talk so much today, Neeraj, because I'm having a cold, so I rather take it a little easy with the voice.
Okay, let's see.
So, no, giving feedback, two major differences. If you want to focus on learning and on the team learning aspects and how to proceed, there's two main differences. once you would get sort of a summative feedback, everyone that's been to school and so on, you get your grade, but you don't learn anything from that. You get feedback, A, B, and C, and so on. And so you're expected to have all that information embedded somewhere else. Now, if you have the formative feedback, and especially if it's given continuously throughout the course or throughout the project in your organization or in your team, they have an open ceiling, so to speak. They're free to talk to one another on the specific areas that are main concern from the project. Then the learning barrier has significant impact of actually moving beyond the expected learning outcomes or the expected deliveries that would be in a team constellation in a project out in an organization. So basically it has strong impact on the learning. So if you want to take something out of, thinking about feedback, think about what is it that I could gain something out of from what's given to me. Oh, it's not working. So worked a little bit with the formative feedback, and here's an interesting, definition from a shoot. Information communicated to the learner that is intended to modify his or her thinking or behavior for the purpose of improving learning. So think about, we will come back on the team level in a little bit. How can we learn from how we act within the team as individuals, and what impact does that have for the team performance? Now, what we will see, especially when Neeraj will show some example of his research, is that we can have tremendous impact on the team if we start to, embrace a little bit more empathy into the process of designing. Another thing here on feedback is that if you have, and this is especially interesting not only for on an academic level but also in a project level in companies, when you have task level feedback versus summary feedback. Think for a moment, what would that be? Well, if I do something, if I'm working on a new car and I will only get the feedback in the end, what people liked and disliked with the car, that would be a waste of time, yes. But what could be changed along the way? So if I get constant feedback on the task level, and you can of course divide this even more on the smaller scale as well along the way, then you get much more opportunities to learn throughout the way. Now, I tried to work, during my time at KTH, I tried to work on these engineering design courses where we have kind of complex setting. I just want to share a little bit on that, how we try to establish some sort of a feedback system to support the team that work towards innovation. And what we focused on are, detailed design, on developing early phase innovation. So they come up with a prototype that sometimes actually led to patent applications and so on. We work with industry on these projects as well, similar to what you've been doing. We've been doing in different formats, measurements or seeing how is the CDR courses run compared to these kind of courses, and what are interesting and so on in terms of the process and so on. So the objective here would be to plan, manage and execute a complex product development work. So the thing is, if you have a complex setting, you probably have many different skills you need to tackle and so on to develop the complexity of finding an innovative product in the end. So this is a brief outline of an early phase of that project. So without diving in too much, it's a lot about trying to get a lot of ideas on the floor on how to develop, come to a solution. Now, partly what we've been discussing is finding about the problem in the first case. So many times we have, in these cases, in other cases that I work with also in the university setting, is that we have a problem or a challenge that the students are getting, or the company, when I've been working with companies, so that you don't narrow it too much. So you have some opening, unless you have, meaning that if you have too little of freedom of action, I would say, it can be, you focus too much on the process and efficiency, you will lack some of the importance that creativity can support in this process. So in this, what's interesting from a feedback perspective here is that we had this stage gate procedure. If you ever heard about Cooper, about stage gate, how to develop new product development, that is something that we applied towards the curricula here. And throughout coming with a new problem definition and towards having new ideas upon the challenge, they started to make mock-ups and CAD drawings and so on, and presented that to the steering committee at the company. Now, what we wanted to do when I said on the last slide before this, that we implemented a feedback system. So I wanted the students in this case then to have some sort of bearing on how can they navigate more easily within the team and support one another. Okay, maybe we missed that slide. So what we developed is a sort of an in-action and post-action reflection process, meaning that once a day, all these, I don't expect you to read this, but what's interesting here, I will get to that graph in a second. What's interesting is I mentioned post-action and in-action. So once they were working 2.5 days a week, full-time then, and we said that, okay, could you have a session in the end where you do this reflection work? And in order to support you in a little bit more objective way, let's put in, some trigger points of interest for you. So we said that, okay, we're working on a deadline basis towards the end. So if we have, completion level, normally it's 100% when you're done for the one specific deadline, right? So we had that. You can see here, these are different, deadlines or part deadlines and so on, or gates, I should say. And then we said, okay, can we add something else? So partly it was, learning, but we ended up with productivity being one. I can repeat that, productivity. So we said, okay, if we can just pinpoint a little bit, yes, let's use the Likert scale and rate how you perceive that throughout the day. By then, in this, small session in the end, and then one of the persons would gather this, and then sort of put them together, and then just starting to look at the deviation in between the low scores and high scores. So this gives you a lot of information within the team about your expectancies and about your motivations, about why you're taking the course in the first place. Think about now, all of a sudden, that you jump into a project within an organization. What would happen if you would do the same? One thing is honesty. Can you be honest about your purpose and intentions here? Were everyone honest and so on in this course? What is there to lose? What is there to gain? So many things that could be, still looked at that we didn't do in that research. But deviation is one thing, but what we also noted is that if we would place this, completion level on top of the other one, the productivity, we could see that all of a sudden, once you get into this, fulfillment for the particular deadline, we saw that productivity was dropping. Can anyone guess why that was happening? Well, because everyone's so satisfied because they were done with everything for the day or so. And then the moment new directives came, the productivity, jumped up again. Interestingly, we can see here that we don't get clear directives. Here, there's a stage gate, but it was unclear. So this was a Thursday. It took 1.5 weeks for the team to get new clear directives, as you can see. But we have done. They were waiting. So this would be really slack in production if it would be out in industry. So once again, communication, how communication works internally is critical, of course, but also within internal, yes, and externally with stakeholders. So another thing, when I worked with pedagogical development later on, was that we noted that something called TNT will explode here, but TMT, so temporal motivation theory, that has the same pattern. And then we started to look into that. Why is that? And how is that related to this? And we touched upon already motivation, which is really interesting here, because, and not only for how to facilitate teams then in industry, but also in academia, when you work on these project settings, if you have a way of actually enhancing motivation, why not go about doing it? So having, if there seems to be a tendency of up and down, if you can sort of understand why that happens and minimize, of course, the downs and facilitate as much as possible when that happens and put up clear objectives along the way, that would make much more efficiency towards the team. So that's an interesting comparison between, motivation theory on top of this as well. And yeah, I think we will move on to something that I mentioned.
Yeah, before
a little bit
this,
different.
yes.
Maybe we should have that.
We can have a break. Just a quick point I want to make to reiterate the importance of feedback and to link it back to something we discussed. The hunter model, where we did the zigzag and the wayfaring. Feedback is very important within that context. Understanding whether you are going in the right direction, understanding how your team is doing moment to moment as you're faced with uncertainty, ambiguity, new knowledge. Feedback becomes very important. And many times for most of us, including myself, the first emotional response to the word feedback is, oh my God, you're going to give me feedback. What did I do wrong? Right? How do we change that to an excitement response? Feedback, wonderful, give me more. That's the key, I think, to getting feedback and to changing the direction. So we can reflect a bit on that of, how do you become excited to get feedback while we have some coffee. Okay. Thank you.
Good.
I think so. Yeah. Okay, everybody, shall we start again? Okay. Think we, yeah. This is mine, right? Okay, I'll put it here. Okay, let us start. What's the Swedish way of starting the questions?
We can be inspired by you. We can do a warm-up exercise. So the warm-up exercise for the part 2 session would be to take your seat in 5 seconds. 3, 2, and...
And what are the consequences of not taking one?
Well,
Okay.
it's not that quiet then.
Okay. So moving forward, we are still at team level. We just heard from Anders about the importance of feedback and the two kinds of feedback, right? We'll move slightly differently now within a team. So a big part of the research we do at the Center for Design Research is at the team level. We go, we observe teams, we are wanting to discover what makes for great teams. And while doing that, while doing my research as part of that, I said that, okay, great teams are not just in the startup world or the corporate world. What other world you have where teams come together and they make new things. And I was really driven towards improvisation, dramatic improvisation and musical improvisation. So are you all familiar with improvisation? Right. Great. So that's an art form where you don't have a script to start out with. And you make things as you go along by responding to your team members and making a music or making a story. But when you're doing improv, I actually come from mechanical engineering, but I spent a couple of years in drama doing improvisational theater and trying to see what it feels like to be in an improvisational team and what are great teams like and what are bad teams like when we're doing improv. And we can feel it that when things are moving on, great, you can actually feel the team make great music. Even as audience, you know that things are going very smoothly, but what's the phenomena behind that? So as a researcher, my next task was to actually codify that, to actually see, can we study this kind of a team interaction which happens without a script? Because a lot of design work doesn't have a fixed script. There may be certain behaviors that we do, but there is no fixed pathway. Once again, coming to the hunter model, there is no straight line from point A to B, and we have to wayfare and meander as we go along. So one of the things which we did in order to study such teams or this team interaction was that we were inspired by music. And just as in music, you have the notation for music where you can record it, you can document from moment to moment. You are capturing the temporality of music as a phenomena. So being inspired by it, we invented a notation for teamwork. So this is just as the musical notation captures the performance of music, the team notation or IDN, the interaction dynamics notation, captures the performance of design teams or innovation teams. So here's an example of that. This is a short video clip of a team from our lab. And this was a startup and they were doing concepts for children's toys. So we recorded their interaction and this is a few minutes of their conversation. So as the video will play, some of these symbols will actually come in the space below and you will get a sense of how the notation works. So let's play the video and see how it sounds.
Could we create something that keeps them
together?
Yeah, so that kids during a car trip, they wouldn't get bored.
I think it's okay.
Then they could do something like Legos, but well, anytime you're dealing with pieces, that's the problem.
Yeah.
So you have to eliminate the whole premise of Lego to make it work.
But to have something like a nest, because it's so boring.
Design like a lab kit so you can play with your Legos?
Yeah, a lab,
Okay.
what did you say? A lab kit.
Yeah, so...
And it could be a lab kid.
So you have your own personal lab kit, and this is your like sandbox of Legos.
Let's use that.
Oh, a Lego sandbox.
I think that's
Lego
great.
sandbox.
So this team came up with this design concept, Lego sandbox. It just happened in a conversation, in an interaction. But this did not come from just one person. There was no one person who said, okay, let's have a Lego sandbox, check mark. Now what's next? Right? It actually came through the interaction between the team. Just as an interaction you might have had right now over coffee or within a cafe or in a business meeting. These interactions are important in the sense of how they lead to ideas or decisions. So how do we record this interaction? So the notation captures or represents that interaction visually. And you can read it from left to right, and you can think of it like a journey that you go along. You have yes and, you have questions which drive you forward. Sometimes you hit a block, sometimes you overcome that. There is support behavior, humor, interruptions, and so on. Right? And then this becomes the visual record of that conversation, of that interaction. So this is what we call the interaction dynamics notation, or IDN in short. And this theoretically derives from two fields. The first field is cognitive semiotics, which actually is about how is meaning conveyed through symbols. And in semiotics, there is a theory called as the force dynamics theory, that the words we speak or the words we use within a narrative, they carry forces. So just as there are physical forces, there are narrative forces that push us, that pull us, and that we can represent those forces. So if I were to say an idea, oh, let's go for a walk, and somebody says, no, it's raining, I would feel a block, I would feel an obstruction. But I can choose to do something with it. I can choose to persist and carry on and say, oh, but we can take an umbrella, or I can choose to accept the block and suggest an alternative or a deflection, which actually gives us these core symbols within the notation. And then the second discipline, improvisational theater, actually has some underlying principles. So no matter what form of art you are looking at, music or drama or even organizational behavior, you see that the principles of improvisation are similar. So the foundations are similar. So principles such as yes and, where we build on each other's ideas, support, questioning, humor, actually happen in most of these conversations. And then after having these symbols as some of the core symbols, we started looking at a lot of different design teams, both within our lab and outside. And then we said that, okay, there's something missing still, and we put in behaviors like ignored or silence, or ambiguous when multiple people talk at a time and it's not clear what's really happening. Right? So this actually forms the symbol set of IDN, the interaction dynamics notation. The key thing here is that the notation is response-based. So in order to give a value to what somebody is saying or doing, because it's also non-verbal, we just don't look at what that person has said or done. We look at how the next team member responds to that person. So it's depending on the response that we characterize a symbol. And that is important, that it actually captures the dynamics of a team. So if I ask a question which is not answered, the question does not exist for the sake of team dynamics, because that did not influence the dynamics between the people. And the same for blocking behavior. I may not have meant to give a block, but if somebody felt blocked, that was a block. So that's what it captures, and it converts the dynamics into, it captures the principal dynamics and it converts it into big data. So now you have a sequence of symbols. If you hear a conversation, if you record a conversation, you can convert it into a symbolic sequence on which you can run data mining algorithms to find out what are the interaction patterns that characterize great teams, what are the interaction patterns that characterize situations which lead to breakthrough ideas or important decisions or new frames for understanding your market. So that gives us a research instrument at a level of fidelity which we didn't have before. This is, for example, a visual of the different topics within a conversation. And on top of the notation, you can then overlay the content variables. So if it's a conversation about generating concepts like the video we saw, you can overlay ideas in red. If it's a conversation about, if it's a strategy meeting, where a decision is being made, you might overlay decision parameters from decision theory on top of the notation. And now you can actually see how is interaction leading to an outcome which has meaning towards the team. So we are doing research with this notation. And very briefly, since we don't have much time, I'll quickly cycle through some of the key findings. So one is that, just as we talked earlier about concept space and knowledge space, we actually found that teams fluctuate between the knowledge space and concept space when they're doing design. And the teams that perform better, that have a higher yield of ideas, actually have much higher rate of fluctuation. The lower performing teams tend to get stuck in one space. They might get stuck in the knowledge space and they debate and they argue or they ask questions about how this will happen, what's the reality of this thing, but they don't move into concept space. Or if they move into concept space, they are lost in the world of dreams and they don't go into the knowledge space. So how do you actually learn to navigate the two becomes important. So how do you navigate the two, right? How do you intentionally navigate the two spaces? Can you develop the skill of facilitating the team that you are in to go back and forth at times? So questions, the kind of questions you ask, yes and responses, help move a team into a concept space or knowledge space. Generally, when we talk about questions, we generally know questions as having one right answer. But when we look at questions that are being asked within a design situation, there's two kinds of questions. One is what we call deep reasoning questions. What is the material of this cup? Or what's the temperature of this coffee? And that has one right answer. But as designers, we also ask generative design questions. We ask, oh, what if I put some vodka in this coffee? That's a generative question. I don't know what will happen next. We can find out later. So one more pattern we found is this notion of blocks. We thought that blocking, would be negative. It's like you're blocking a person, you're blocking an idea, and that we thought that blocking would be more common in low-performing teams. But actually, blocking was more common in higher-performing teams. What they did well was to use blocks to actually move themselves forward. So what we can say is block recovery. How do you turn a block into a generative phenomena? How do you respond to a block with overcoming, deflecting, with generative design questions, and not take blocks personally and shut down? So that actually was very interesting finding for us. And now what we're doing with students is that rather than telling them, the common rules of brainstorming, defer judgment, say, if you have judgment, say it, but learn how to deal with it and how to make it generative so that it actually catapults you forward rather than obstructs you and saying, oh, I'm not supposed to say that thing, So that's important too. So one more thing regarding blocks is sometimes when we see records of interaction, we see this kind of a pattern, block overcoming, block overcoming, block overcoming. And we see these two people having an argument. And nobody's willing to let go. They're just butting heads at each other. And sometimes this can be quite destructive. And sometimes actually they are correlated with a more positive or a greater utility of the concepts you deliver. So having a mini debate on your team, actually we have found is correlated with higher utility or usefulness of the concepts that you're delivering. So how do you then foster not having a stubborn yes, no kind of an argument, but how do you then drill down into a concept, into the knowledge space where you come up with something that can be very useful to the team? So this notation then gives you certain patterns of behavior that we can learn to foster. We can also ask questions, what if, with the notation? What if, I do block, deflection, yes and. What does it feel like? And you become more generative even at the level of the kind of interactions you have within your team. What we are doing with the notation now is that we are using it as a diagnostics. So we are actually looking more and more into teams within a laboratory setting on one hand, but we have also started working with a number of design courses. We have also started working with companies, with corporate partners to really take the notation to company teams and really give them a new way of seeing themselves. So we do the notation video-based or sometimes even real-time. We train people in the real-time notation. And then that becomes personalized coaching for the team to improve performance. So the teams, actually, we are not at a stage yet where we can give them normative results, where we can say, oh, look here, you did this thing right, you did this thing wrong. We cannot say that because teams are a complex phenomenon. Even if we found some patterns within the laboratory, we cannot generalize that to, let's say, the Swedish context or the German context, or Chinese context. So context matters quite a bit, but where the notation helps is that it holds a mirror to the team. It says, this is what your team looks like. What do you think? Does it match with your perception? Does it match with how you perceive your team members? What would you like to do with these things? These are some patterns we found within our research. What if you do more of those patterns? What will happen then? So the notation gives the team a sense of what to do and how to transform the way they are interacting to come to better outcomes. So that's at team level. I saw a few hands go up. Maybe a quick question or two. Yes? Oh, so maybe I can repeat that question. I think the question was, what's the definition of a high-performance team? Right. So for the studies which I've shown, we were actually looking at the quantity of ideas, the yield. So they were in a concept generation activity. So we break down design into various kind of situations. It could be a framing situation where you have a lot of data and you have to make sense of it and come to a perspective. It could be a situation where you have come to a perspective, you might need to generate various solutions and navigate that concept space, you saw. It might be a situation where you have to make a decision now. Right? We were looking more in the concept generation scenario. Yes, so it was the yield. So in the first study, that was the yield because yield matters. So through research, we have found that good ideas or bad ideas, it's very difficult to normalize towards one right away. What you can do is maximize the yield, and then you have a lot of things to play with, to combine, to synthesize. So even if you have two bad ideas, you might combine them to make a good one. So that's where the benefit lies. The second study which we did, where I showed you the argumentation, we then went to saying that what's the quality of those ideas. And that's we started judging in terms of novelty on one side and usefulness. And that's where the argumentation came in. That argumentation helped drive concepts towards usefulness a bit more. Yeah. One last question and then we'll move forward. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got to this correlation between good ideas and certain fluctuations. But what is the argument behind saying that it's the certain fluctuations that make the good ideas and not the opposite way? Like the good ideas are what are fostering those certain fluctuations. Like what is that makes us say that the fluctuations are the cause and not the conclusion?
Yeah, so we have not done a causality study yet. What we're doing is, since we're dealing with a complex phenomena, we learn to play on both sides. So we say that, okay, you are in a team situation. A team is a complex phenomena. It's not a deterministic phenomena all the time. So we say, let's try to see if you fluctuate more, what will happen, right? And we have found that teams have found it helpful to actually go back and forth quickly, to actually drive down the yield of ideas. Once again, it's not the quality, but the yield that we are looking at. And they can come back. So in a team, it's very rare that you want, repeat certain things or repeat ideas or repeat topics. And that happens too. So there's also been research on that front that you might come up with a topic at 5 minutes into the conversation, and somehow that comes back at 15 minutes in a very different way, and that combines with something else and leads to some different thing. Right? Yeah, great. Okay, let's move forward. We have 2 more levels to go. Imagine that. What time is it? No more time. Okay.
Well, I think we will at least jump into a little bit of it. Okay. So, so I think we can actually, if we memorize a little bit what we saw in the Hunter model earlier, and actually emphasize that the anchoring, the importance of taking it forward and realizing the idea is crucial. I think that would be enough said on how we want to explore this. Now, what we found in some studies also have been that this decision making becomes very, very crucial in the convergence stages of a process where you try to establish innovation. So partly, all these roles that can be called gatekeepers, boundary roles, change agents of all kinds, product managers, and so on. Everyone that has a way of hindering, putting up some sort of obstacle in the process of your argumentation, in the process of, for the team or for you as an individual to take next step. Those are critical for the whole process, not only for the team, but of course, and for the whole organizational environment. And then what we can see seems to be having a huge impact is, of course, the personal commitment for all these, champions or whatever you want to call them, that drive the support of the idea forward. And here, if we think about the facilitation from either a course level or whether it would be in a project team, in a corporate environment, we can see that you have how do you actually facilitate this for in a good way. Now, there are people acting on formal/informal level of power in order to get the work done. And actually, we've been scouting that in an academic environment also, how you could actually explore that a little bit further, how you develop your curriculums and so on. And what we found is that basically the environment that you're stuck in or that you are working in, that has tremendous impact on how you actually get to navigate on the formal level versus informal power that you can get around. So, and of course, during the break also we talked about change. Now we're taking out all the change slides from this presentation, but you have a huge ton of that because change/innovation to us is kind of they're stick together. And of course, the natural resistance towards change makes just numerous innovations just disappear before they are even started, which is a shame, of course. So one thing that we have noted organizational level is that if you have all these silos, organizations and academia, I would say, try to break those. Try to find these hybrid formats where you can actually work on a more generative basis, where you are allowed to explore one another's knowledge, because that really makes sense. And sometimes you have, from a production point of view, if I would be in charge of a company, or that this can make sense, fully sense. I don't know if you can read it, but it says that you have these specific roles within a company, and that whether everything is too defined, you compete on the motivation of actually getting the job done, which kills morale. So if you remember, Steve Jobs has been talking about if we would have smartest people, they tell us what to do rather than we should tell them. This is about a little bit of, we don't place them here. Rather, we want them to explore and find their own role and try to develop the business that we have. So meaning that if you can have a fruitful commitment to the people involved, whether that would be on team level or organization level, try to make sure that the workflow within those teams, within the organization boundaries, can be there to support and optimize the performance in such a way. Let's go back a little bit to your environment. I think we should just cut through a little bit of the slides so we can actually touch upon the. So this is CDR environment.
Yeah, just cycle through. So what we'll do is, 3 slides per second.
Yeah.
So we'll play a little movie. I will just cycle through slides. Whatever you see which interests you, please ask questions.
That's India.
That's India, yeah. So we did the same environment in multiple locations to see what's the influence of culture, how you can work with that. Personal and organizational courage, very much needed in an organizational sense. These are a couple of stories which we'll share afterwards, possibly. Interpersonal dynamics, how do you design environments for great teamwork? In multiple cultures. It's not just a single culture phenomena. Factors at ecosystem level, how can you help regions transform, where it's not just transformation, but the rate of transformation that matters, whether you can transform in 5 years or 50. What will power this transformation? Once again, interactions, creative, collaborative behaviors across boundaries, age boundaries, domain boundaries, focusing on a few high growth ventures rather than multiple low growth ones. It's not just the number of entrepreneurs that matters, it's what are they doing that matters. What we do is we help build such environments. We build a nucleus where we generate or grow a new culture and then diffuse it outwards and do research to try to document what are the factors, and this is not moving forward. I don't know why. Okay, here it is. We measure the flow of things, flow of capital, flow of knowledge and ideas. It is not the accumulation that matters, it's the flow that matters in our view. And that's what we have come to. The faster that things flow within a city, the more prosperous the ecosystem. And we use this word behavioral infrastructure to actually say that, how do you develop the capability? We need physical service knowledge, data, but we also need behavioral infrastructure. We had this little clip. There's a nice documentary called Something Ventured from one of the, it's a documentary of the early venture capitalists and how they worked with the entrepreneurs and what was their mindset. And I think it should be online or on Netflix or somewhere. No, I think that will take time. But please have a look. I think that has some very good cases that are being documented. This was a case of Apple about what role the investors played in the starting of Apple and what crucial part they did to mentor these youngsters to grow a venture. And we often miss those behaviors in the myth of the lone entrepreneur, the myth of Steve Jobs. I mean, he played a very crucial part, but so did his team. And that's important to note. So what is this behavioral infrastructure and how do you transform a culture towards that or bias it towards that is important. This is a metaphor again. We love metaphors, as you would have found out by now.
Yeah, but you jumped ahead. Let's go back to the metaphor for 1 second.
It's okay. Yes.
Tell us.
Okay, so we use this metaphor of a neural, what happens in a brain, and as signals flow through a network of neurons, if we have the behavioral infrastructure within a region, within a city, then capital will flow faster, knowledge will flow faster, and I think, over that network. So once again, a lot of times we see studies about the density of relationships. And that is not the only thing that matters. Having a dense network is necessary, but what kind of interactions are happening on that dense network is very important. If you have a dense network which is biased towards a more status-seeking tendency, which is biased towards having power concentrated within a few people, that is not going to lead towards innovation. So how do you measure that? How do you understand that? It's important too. And here is things flowing over the neural network. So these are two cases. We did a field site. We did a center in the city of Abeokuta in Nigeria, where we tried to build this kind of a nucleus, where we worked with local entrepreneurs, to set up these new behaviors, to understand how do you now try to set up these relationships, these interactions between entrepreneurs, between investors and entrepreneurs. And so we learned a few things, some observations that happened. Then we did a second case study, which was much longer. We went on for 6 years in Ahmedabad in India, and it is still going on. So we had handed it to the local university, which is doing this work now. But we started working with a group of investors, brought in knowledge, worked with entrepreneurs, formed local networks, ventures launched, so on and so forth. Right? So a lot of centers are doing that. That is happening here right now in this space. What we were doing was to measure the quality of interactions. Once again, bringing in a research perspective to say what is happening as people talk, and not just let people talk, and give them feedback. Once again, the keyword feedback, right? And really see what are the forces, cultural forces, economic forces, which are hindering some people from participating. How can we work with them to overcome those forces, help empower the people? So that's what the research was about. And once again, the role of physical spaces. How do you design spaces? What are some factors you need to do? How do you design these relationships, interactions? How do you work with materials? In a culture where working with hands is frowned upon, so working against cultural factors and creating a bias towards working with hands, working with investors to see the more long-term perspective rather than a short-term return mindset. And how might we do that? So these are some of the things we tried. This is important. We also believe that it's not just launching ventures that matters. It's also how the ventures grow and mergers and acquisitions and partnerships on a global stage. That's what we call a secondary market, a market of and for the ventures. So we formed a network with venture capital firms, with banks globally, across countries, to now connect these entrepreneurs with companies in various other regions. So they can say, okay, I have a company in Japan that needs something that you are making. Maybe let's make a partnership. Because that's how companies scale up. It's not just the number of entrepreneurs launched that matters, once again. So creating a secondary market, a very active secondary market, is very important. Key outcomes from 5 years, once again, some numbers. You can look at it maybe when you watch the video next. We'll move on. Key lessons. We realize it's necessary to align capital sources very early in the ecosystem. So now, after doing this field work, we have been working more on the financial side, working with venture investors, working with other people. Venture investing is generally has, as you would know, a return span. The thinking is 10 years. When you want to develop a region, that's not the thinking span you need. How do you have an ecosystem fund? How do you build a behavioral infrastructure fund to develop a region and not to extract value from a few ventures? We need a different kind of an investor for this. We are trying to see how do you create this new kind of investors. Development at ecosystem level, how do we make them visible through measurement and narratives? We found that the environments we worked in, people were still concerned about themselves, at the most with their organizations, not the whole ecosystem. It's very difficult to perceive the whole ecosystem. How do you sense it became important. Grooming young leaders who are driven by empathy and novelty, rather than people who are driven by status. Many times, some of our partners, when they wanted to fill in leadership roles, they looked at resumes, a big mistake. We need to look at behaviors and what behaviors they are displaying. So we learned from that mistake. Yeah, so ecosystem development activities, a lot of times we were also guilty of focusing just on the startups too much. We realized that when we work within a region, how do we actually work with the economic strength of that region? How do we create partnerships between companies of various scales already within that region? And create a vibrant exchange ecosystem. So that's something that we are working on now. So these were some of the lessons at an ecosystem level that we have learned. So that's the end of our slide deck, and this is the key question that comes to mind. We threw a lot of information at you, knowledge at you. What do you want to do with it? Once again, knowing is not enough. We need to do something. So I would urge you to think about that, and thank you. Okay.
Time flies. Unfortunately, there will be no time for questions because it's already 5.
Okay.
So, but you stay here
yes,
for a while. If someone wants to ask questions, it's okay. And also maybe via email.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. So. Please feel free to ask them. And I want to thank you with a small gift. We support UNICEF's work through School in a Box. It's another way of disseminate research or knowledge, maybe. So please, and thank you. It was so interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry. Oh, something fell off. Okay.
You have to see. It's an A on the one and N on the one.
Oh, yeah, this is N.
But you got the right one.
Good, thank you.